We're going to listen to our first speaker, Isla McGregor. Isla has worked as an advocate for whistleblowers in Tasmania and Australia since the 1990s. And Isla met Sheila Jeffries in 2012, where she worked on the campaign against the push for full decriminalisation of the sex trade in Tasmania. In 2018, Isla, with several other women, set up Women Speak Tasmania to oppose self-ID legislation in Tasmania.
The very first time that I met Sheila Jeffries was back in 2012, as you say, when Sheila came to Tasmania to lobby state politicians and non-government organisations. We worked together for a few days and had numerous meetings with politicians and representatives of peak social justice organisations. And I must say, it was the beginning of now a 10-year period that I have been absolutely shocked at the degree of censorship, attacks on women, slander, undermining, to all the women globally who are working on these issues. I often refer to women working on the Declaration campaign issues as the canaries down the mine. And this is the biggest mass whistleblowing movement that I think the world is seeing at this time from women. When Sheila came here, there was an attempt to stop her from speaking at two public forums that we organised. One was at a public venue at the Quaker Meeting House, and the other was at the University of Tasmania Law School. Jade Barker, who worked with the Scarlet Alliance, which is the pimp front group here in Australia, threatened to smear one of our co-organisers' names all over Hobart if this forum went ahead, and attempted to have the Quakers withdraw the venue. The UTAS Law School resisted the attempt at no platforming Sheila, which was very pleasant. Media were not going to do an interview with Sheila, given the controversial nature of this debate here in Tasmania. That was very disappointing. But once we put out a media release on the attempt of no platforming, our national broadcaster actually asked Sheila in for an interview with the ABC. So that was the beginning of the campaign. And when Sheila was here, it was the first time I'd ever heard about the cotton ceiling. I was utterly gobsmacked at the backstory to the transgender issues and how that was, interconnected with the campaign on the global sex trade. So from then on, it was just a matter of time before, within about 3 years, the impacts of my and my fellow feminist position on transgenderism became targeted by trans rights activists. By 2015, 5 women from the UTAS Women's Collective were expelled without giving any reasons, but essentially after they had been interrogated online about their views on trans ideology. Bronwyn Williams submitted a formal complaint to UTAS about the Feminist Collective. It got nowhere. Bronwyn also had an article published in the university student paper Tagatis, which, interestingly enough, 3 years later was censored. It was removed, citing defamatory imputations. But nevertheless, it had remained posted for 3 years. we continued to work on sex trade events right through from 2016 to 2018. At the beginning of 2016, the Law Reform Institute published a discussion paper on amendments to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act, which was effectively a way of implementing self-ID legislation. A member of the Women's Liberation Front here in Tasmania, Tessa Ann, wrote a submission to the then Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, Robin Banks, outlining her concerns about this options paper. It was, the paper was titled Legal Recognition of Sex and Gender Diversity in Tasmania, Options for Amendments to the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act, 1999. Tessa Ann wanted to meet with Robin Banks because she was very dissatisfied with a lot of the definitions and the explanations in the paper. So she arranged to have a meeting with Robin Banks and her policy advisor, Lisa Wagner. During that 2.5-hour meeting to discuss the issues and ask questions, Tessa became very distressed and was very unhappy with the way that she had been treated. This was an event that would reach the Australian press. It was 2 articles were published in our national paper, The Australian, by Tasmanian journalist Matthew Denham, basically saying that Tessa had allegations of bullying, intimidation and ridiculing by the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner and the policy advisor. So I think it's indicative that, you know, even the people at top levels in institutions and government so-called anti-discrimination agencies are prepared to apply the very tactics they've been put in positions to prevent. And I think it's also sends a big statement that legislation is not the answer to a lot of issues concerning women's human rights, that it is cultural change and very profound cultural change that needs to occur. And that is why we now have this groundswell of activism amongst women, spreading word in the community about exactly what that cultural change means. We organised an event at Parliament House for International Women's Day in 2017. Tessa Ann was one of the speakers. This was an event, once again, talking about the global sex trade. We sent invitations to the President of Tasmanian Women Lawyers, Adrian Morton, and requested that that invitation be forwarded to all her members. Morton wrote back to us and said that she would not pass the invitation on to Tasmanian women lawyer members, citing that there was a Wolf member speaking at our forum, and the views of that Wolf member on transgender issues were unconscionable. So we did follow up with complaints to the President, the board of Tasmanian women lawyers, but they were completely fobbed off. So by this stage, it was clear that most women's organisations in Tasmania had become transgendered. In 2017, a lot of you will be familiar with Dr. Robert Jensen and his book, The End of Patriarchy, Radical Feminism for Men. Robert was over in Australia for the Sydney, I think it was the Sydney Writers' Festival, to speak on a panel and to give a series of talks in various states in Australia. We invited him down to Hobart to give a lecture on World Environment Day on June the 5th. And he was talking about toxic masculinity and the environment. And this, of course, was, quite a useful but controversial topic to some people within UTAS. The chair of the forum was Dr. Meredith Nash. She was the deputy director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change and a senior lecturer in sociology. Unfortunately, she withdrew from chairing the forum 2 hours before the forum was to go ahead. And this left us a little bit in the lurch. We weren't prepared. Simone Watson from NORMAC took over chairing of the forum. The reason that Meredith Nash had withdrawn from chairing was that she had had complaints from the UTAS Women's Collective, once again alerting Meredith Nash to Robert Jensen's views on transgenderism. By 2017, late in 2017, the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute held a public forum at the University Lecture Theatre on the discussion paper on self-ID. We attempted to be at that forum, to actually be on the panel for a discussion, but our application was rejected. No excuses given, no response whatsoever. So it was a very shut down process of only having the ideological line being pushed by the UTAS Tasmanian Law Reform Commission. In 2018, I had published an article on Tasmanian Times outlining 5 case studies of censorship and suppression in Tasmania on these issues. It was titled Silencing and Censorship in the Trans Rights Debate in Tasmania. Dr. Meredith Nash, who had removed herself from chairing Robert Jensen's forum, sent a letter to Lindsay Tuffin, the editor of this journal, Tasmanian Times, threatening defamation action. Lindsay contacted me and asked me what my side of the story was, which I provided, and he persisted in keeping my article posted on Tasmanian Times. I will say, in Australia, Tasmanian Times was the only free speech journal in this country that allowed radical feminist voices to be constantly published. Very sadly, Lindsay handed over the reins of Tasmanian Times about, I think, 4 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago. And the new editor, a Green Party member, absolutely refused to publish any more of radical feminist articles on the website, and also went further to remove comments from key articles that we had published, or even remove articles, which sadly was not a part of the arrangement between the previous editor when he sold on the journal. In October 2018, Women Speak Tasmania ramped up. We started a Facebook page. We started putting out regular media releases on the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Act, which eventually was rammed through the lower house of State Parliament in November that year, without any proper debate or proper community consultation. We were not contacted for comment by any papers or TV stations. Eventually, we did do interviews on radio with one small broadcaster here, and there was one opinion piece that was published in the Mercury only after the bill was pushed through the lower house. One radio host with ABC here, Rick Goddard, was heard criticising Women Speak Tasmania on radio one morning. I was notified about this and I contacted him and demanded an immediate interview that morning. Myself and Bronwyn Williams went into the studio and had an interview at 10:30, which was pre-recorded, and it would be the most hostile interview that I've ever had with media in my life. Matthew Denham did write a couple of articles around that time, representing our views in the national paper, The Australian. Around this time, four women's non-government organisations put out a media release condemning Women Speak Tasmania. The organisations were the Women's Legal Service, In Gender Equality, which used to be called SHE, Self-Help and Empowerment, Hobart Women's Shelter and Women's Health Tasmania. They said in their media release, there is no research or service experience to suggest that men who seek to harm women change their gender or masquerade as transgender women in order to do so. Acknowledging in law the human rights of transgender people does not reduce the human rights enjoyed by non-transgender people. Protecting women's rights and supporting transgender people are not mutually exclusive. To the extent that WST have an issue with that, it is clearly an ideological one, and in its effect, it is discriminatory. Their media release didn't get coverage in the media either, I should mention. But what's interesting is who was on the board of some of those organisations. Robin Banks, Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, was on Women's Legal Service Board. UTAS Meredith Nash was on the board of Women's Health Tasmania, as was Jade Barker from the Scarlet Alliance. And Alina Thomas, the CEO of In Gender Equality, was also a member of the Scarlet Alliance. This cabal of groups also attacked Women Speak Tasmania when they gave their presentations to the Legislative Council in mid-November. In 2018, Women Speak Tasmania was scheduled to have a Human Rights Week event on the 10th of December to talk about the impacts of gender law reforms on women and children and LGBT people. Robin Banks wrote a letter to the organisation who was hosting us, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And this was leaked to us, but it was a sort of a public leak through circulation. Now, we have to bear in mind Robin Banks was the former Anti-Discrimination Commissioner. And in this email, she wrote to the then president of WILP, Lindley Grant, and she said, I'm writing out of concern for WILP, having just seen the invitation to your Human Rights Week event at which you have Women Speak Tasmania as the speakers. I anticipate that the reason you have invited this group is their apparent promotion of women's rights. Sadly, this is not a group that support human rights for all. They have at present a nasty and untruthful campaign targeting members of Tasmania's gender diverse community. They do not support the human rights of people who are gender diverse. Indeed, they deny their very humanity and existence. The giving to this group a platform for their hateful views by WILP will be seen by many in the LGBTI community as an endorsement of WILP, by WILP of those views. This is the very real potential to damage the reputation of an extraordinary and compassionate, long-standing human rights group. If there is any way that I can help you to negotiate what I think it is a very difficult situation, I am happy to do so. Robin Banks. Now, unfortunately for Robin Banks, Matthew Denham at The Australian got hold of this email, and he wrote up, once again, a couple of articles about this in the national press. She, of course, tried to worm her way out of this, but we'll get to some reflections on Robin Banks coming up to recent times regarding our coming public forum. In August 2018, Women Speak Tasmania publicly released proposals for reforms to the Anti-Discrimination Act 1998. These proposals were pulled together by Bronwyn Williams, and numerous discussions were had with the Legislative Councillor Ivan Dean. He put forward amendments to the Legislative Council based on our discussions, but these alternative proposals were not allowed to be discussed in the Legislative Council in full. So we really didn't have a chance from the get-go. Coming up to more contemporary times, we ran a campaign on a proposal by a Hobart City Councillor, Jax Fox, previously named Holly Ewan, who wanted gender-inclusive signage in Hobart City Council toilets. I attended several Hobart City Council meetings to present our point of view about these issues. Very hostile meeting with some of the women at those committees on council. Jax Fox attempted to have myself or any other women from Women Speak Tasmania banned from attending any council meetings and speaking at all. You know, Jax Fox was very embedded in the gender identity lobby, worked with TRAS and key people in the movement over here like Rodney Croom and Martine Delaney. So the gender lobby have mounted a very concerted campaign against Women Speak Tasmania. It hasn't been effective. They understand that every time they do negative things towards us, that we're likely to get some traction, not necessarily in the media, but Hobart's a very small town. And I think that one of our advantages in Tasmania is that this is a very small state. Our population is 500,000. The capital has a population of 200,000. So we have a lot of access to politicians, community organisations. A lot of people know each other. I certainly have a background with my work advocating for whistleblowers on multiple different issues, social justice and environmental issues. So people do know what has been happening to us. We've had some major support from Annie Warburton, who was previously a journalist with the ABC, and Councillor Jeff Briscoe. And we did run in Human Rights Week a couple of years ago an award for service to free speech, which was dedicated to both Annie and Jeff for speaking up publicly in defence of women's rights to participate in these debates. Now, coming up to date, the Coalition for Biological Reality, under the helm of Stasia Free, have had in train a national public forum to be held in Hobart in another 2 weeks on the impacts of gender law reforms. Jax Fox from Hobart City Council, the Lord Mayor, Anna Reynolds, and one other Green councillor, Helen Burnett, have campaigned to have our forum cancelled. A motion was put before council in January this year, and that motion failed on a vote 9-3. Unfortunately, the media have only covered this briefly. We had a small write-up in the paper at the end of last year over this, well, must be nearly an 18-month campaign to prevent this forum going ahead, because it's been deferred twice before over COVID issues. This week's been a huge debacle in our federal parliament with the debate on the Religious Freedom Bill. The issue of women's sex-based rights has come home to roost finally in a big way in Australia just this week. And Senator Claire Chandler has just tabled a bill in the federal Senate for amendment of the Sex Discrimination Act to save women's sports, but it will have a much bigger implication. But I just thought it was really important to let everybody know that the fight for women is now in the public arena in a massive way, and the conflict has taken off.